Hello and welcome. My name is Nadine Long. The subject of my book review and analysis is the Ruskin Heights tornado that took place on May 20th, 1957. The book is Caught in the Path: A Tornado's Fury, A Community's Rebirth by Carolyn Glenn Brewer. I would argue that the overall purpose of the book is to put a face on this particular disaster. Along those lines, I'd like to read an excerpt taken directly from the book of part of the author's interview with one of the survivors, Mrs. Woodling. Quote, "I didn't see where Diane, who was almost 5, and Dean, who was 2, went. But I grabbed hold of our 3-year-old Denise's arm. It seemed like for a second or so, time stood still, and I looked at her face. Time was frozen. She was petrified. I never will forget the look on her face. I had hold of her arm, and the tornado sucked her up. I pulled her down, and it sucked her up, and I pulled her down again. It sucked her up a third time, and I tried to pull, but God's angel just opened up my hand, and I felt a voice saying, 'Let go. I've got her.' That's the feeling I had. It was like a spirit telling me." End quote. After reading that, I have to honestly say that I couldn't wait to get to the portion of the book where I could find out whatever happened to little Denise. So I rushed to the back of the book, or towards the end of the book, and I was able to find another interview with Mrs. Woodling. And tragically, I found out that little Denise perished in the tornado. I'll also have to admit that I cried. Facts about the deadly tornado. First, let's just discuss some general information. Tornadoes are violently rotating columns of air extending from a thunderstorm to the ground. Tornadoes are most often associated with the central United States, but they have been documented in all 50 states. Tornadoes can also occur at any time of the year, although the peak season for tornadoes in the Kansas City area is the spring and summer. Now, the deadliest of the Ruskin Heights tornado was the deadliest of a Central Plains tornado outbreak sequence that occurred from May 19 through May 21st in 1957. The tornado was actually a level F5, and it hit on May 20th. And at an F5, it was the highest level of the sequence. Winds were estimated to be in excess of 200 miles per hour. And within the first 48 hours, 39 people were reported dead in Ruskin Heights. In later years, 5 more people died from injuries they sustained during the tornado. The author, Carolyn Glenn Brewer, is a social historian and a Ruskin survivor. In the book, Brewer gives an account of the disaster seen through the eyes of survivors, including herself. Although she was only 7 years old at the time, Brewer has vivid memories of the horrifying event. She interviewed dozens of families and features most of their stories verbatim. The book brilliantly illustrates the pain and suffering of the people of Ruskin Heights. while it highlights their strong sense of community, courage, and resiliency. Her book serves as a reminder that the area is a part of what is called Tornado Alley. The book is very uniquely set up. It has 9 chapters with titles that reflect the specific nature of that part of the interview. So while the subtopics change, the interviewees remain the same throughout the book. For instance, chapter Roman numeral 2, Look at This Cloud, is primarily discussions with the survivors about, what they were doing, right before the tornado hit. And most of the interviewees admit that they were completely caught off guard, that they hadn't taken the warning seriously, and when it touched down, they had to scramble for shelter and scramble to save their lives and the lives of their families. Here, I would like to discuss prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery before, during, and after the tornado. As far as prevention, protection, and mitigation are concerned, twice before, on May 30th, 1879, and May 23rd, 1946, powerful tornadoes hit the same area. Fewer lives were lost as the area was sparsely populated during those times. In the 1950s, after the Great Depression and the war, the mood of the country was changing. Achieving the American dream was the focus. As a result, massive suburban housing development began to take root, similar to Levittown in Long Island, New York. The builder, who was Pravers, offered 4 styles of homes. Only one style featured a basement. Basement models were usually at either end of the block. Basements were supposed to provide protection during a tornado. During the 1957 tornado, families sought shelter in the basements of their neighbors. In the aftermath of the tornado, many of the area's buildings were constructed to serve as storm shelters. Also, technology for tracking tornadoes improved. And finally, the overall community compliance with readiness protocols during tornado warnings greatly improved. The following is a rundown of the response and recovery effort. May 20th, day of the storm. Governor Blair declares martial law and called out the National Guard. Mayor Bartle requested the assistance of the Kansas City police and firefighters earlier in that afternoon. Southwestern Bell Telephone Company set up emergency communication centers for the National Guard at 4 locations. The Missouri Public Service and Gas Service Company worked all night to shut off gas mains. The Salvation Army arrived within 90 minutes after the funnel hit, and the Red Cross had an office set up the next morning, serving coffee and hundreds of sandwiches. Of course, FEMA was created more than 20 years after the Ruskin Heights tornado disaster. Finally, I would like to discuss what I believe is a central theme throughout the whole book, and that is strong sense of community. Brewer's work highlighted the overwhelming sense of community as Ruskin Heights residents and outsiders alike worked tirelessly to rebuild the community. The author gives accounts of how aid poured in as the country learned of the disaster. She states in the text that, quote, complacency blew away with everything else, exposing generosity and compassion. Thousands of people poured into the small community over a period of days and weeks immediately following the disaster. Interestingly, there are sources that suggest that the outpouring of people was largely self-serving. A functional analysis of collective behavior in a disaster is an article published in the Sociological Quarterly. The authors, Duscher and New, argue that such activity is, quote, not unlike the floods of humanity, which have historically gravitated towards such phenomena as gold rushes and land rushes, end quote. They refer to it as a, quote, convergence pattern in which many show up simply out of curiosity rather than a real desire to help those impacted by the disaster. While this may be true in some cases, I would rather take the position of Carolyn Glenn Brewer, that the hearts of countless numbers of people were opened. And, as Carolyn Brewer states, because of the response of those touched by the victims, new connections formed, end quote. The last page is a listing of references. Thank you for your attention and thank you for your time.